This is the next of our videos about William Blake in terms of how you might go about answering questions on paper 2 of the English Literature AQA paper, syllabus B. And in this video we're going to look at another pair of poems, the pair of Chimney Sweeper poems, One Innocence, One Experience. As ever, we're going to try to see them in terms of how they relate to this overarching theme of politics and political and social protest. We're going to look at the usual kind of analysis methods there to explore the detail of the poems, but we're also going to mention the past questions that have come up so far on Blake as a way of thinking about how we can tie these poems into a possible exam essay. There is no comparison as part of the assessment of this essay, but it makes sense that you might pair up poems and make some comparison between the two poems in the different sections. In particular, reading the Innocence poem in the light of the Experience one and seeing the layers of irony there. If we look at the Innocence poem to begin with, we can see first of all that it is about a child, and we have this kind of depiction of its suffering there in the first stanza with the very simple repetition of weep, and it clearly makes us feel that this child is suffering and we feel sorry for it. It's not a very complicated idea. However, from that point on, things go a little awry. The child speaks the poem throughout, and he talks about his friend Tom Dacre. Again, there's plenty of reason to sympathise with Tom Dacre with his reference to the lamb, so this innocence figure there, and how his hair's been shaved off. And this is where we as readers seem to diverge from the narrative voice, who doesn't seem to see that as a terrible assault, but we would, to have your hair shaved off against your wishes. And then you get this naivety of innocence, which is one of the things that the poems hint at in the innocence section, that there's a gullibility and naivety that comes along with innocence that is dangerous. So it's not all a good thing, and that, again, as we might often say, the equation of innocence equals good and experience equals bad is not correct in these poems. There are bad things about being in a state of innocence, and this is one of them, that you are vulnerable to these kinds of what Marxists might call false consciousness, of accepting your fate and acting as if things are good when they're not. So Tom is comforted by the child, and that's sweet and good in a way, but as we'll see at the end of the poem, it seems to suggest that that in itself is a block on potential social action. There's a dream sequence in the middle of the poem, and that seems to be a dream of the children being released from their coffins, their chimney sweeping jobs, and where they live, and how they live in this dirt and confinement. But they're released by angels into what seems like an image of death, really, of heaven. And that could be, therefore, Blake's suggestion that there is this religious idea that the poor and the disadvantaged, the underprivileged, and anyone who suffers should just really tolerate and put up with that, because they'll get their reward in heaven, and that God loves them and sympathises with them, but doesn't do anything to alleviate their suffering in this life. However, he will reward them for their patience and endurance in death. Well, that's an argument you can make, but Blake doesn't believe in that. Blake clearly shows in many of his other poems that he wants to see the world improved to here and now, and that his idea is to make God's kingdom on earth, not to wait for heaven, in which God's kingdom already exists. And so this seems to be very much a heavily ironic poem because of that. At the end of the poem is the real kind of clincher there, and so Tom awoke, and we arose in the dark and got with our bags and brushes to work. And so they get on and they carry on working, they carry on suffering, nothing's changed. Tom's happy, and the final line seems to be something straight from one of those sort of Isaac Watts moral poems: if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. We could take that at face value and say the poem is endorsing that kind of idea of duty and patience and resilience and perseverance. But as we look at the other poem, it clearly can't be read in that way. This is a naivety that leads to acceptance of one's fate. If one doesn't protest, and this takes us right to the heart of this unit, protest is the key thing, and here Tom and the narrator are not going to protest about their mistreatment because they've accepted it. And that means that nobody really will have any reason to do anything to alleviate that suffering because they don't really know that those two children are suffering. They seem to be happy. And that is mentioned in the second poem, that if you seem to be happy, who's going to do anything to help you? They're just going to say, well, what's the problem? If we look briefly at the questions that have come up so far, the first question asked about there being no escape from constraints. Here the only escape seems to be in a dream and in heaven, but they are, in the end, still very much constrained, and so that image would be useful for this question. The second of the questions that's come up so far was about oppressive and controlling parents. The parents are conspicuous by their absence in this poem, but they are mentioned in the second one, so that's where we'll look at that. Religion equals misery rather than comfort and joy. Well, again, there's no direct reference to religion in the poem, but this does seem to be implying that a certain kind of religious belief and approach leads to misery because you accept your misery in the hope of a heavenly reward. And that kind of comfort is something that Blake is suspicious of. Human spirit has power to resist. Well, here there is no resistance, and that's the problem. So again, you could refer to this as the issue, that resistance doesn't come about because of the naivety of the narrator. There's no hope for the marginalised was the question in 2021, and again that really seems to be the case in this poem, that these marginalised characters of Tom, the other chimney sweeps and the narrator, so their situation does seem to be hopeless at the end. They're just stuck in a rut of doing their duty, knowing no other way. Personal relationships are liberating and empowering was the question in 2022. Well, if there's a personal relationship here between Tom and the narrator, that is not liberating and empowering. It's the opposite, really. It's confining and it's restricting. Authority figures are unkind and have no compassion. Well, there are no particular authority figures mentioned in the poem, but they are mentioned more so in the second of the poems. And again, the implication here is that the chimney sweep who employs these boys and their parents who've allowed them to be taken into this employment are those sort of authority figures who seem to be completely indifferent to the suffering of the children. Innocence leads to joy and happiness was the 2024 question, and that clearly is not the case here. Although you could argue that, yes, both Tom and the narrator do seem to be quite joyful and happy in their own way, but that joy and happiness is problematic, and that's what we really have to analyse and explore, that if it does lead to joy and happiness, it's not a good thing. So the poem in itself is already useful, and there's enough in it to say that probably we've got to read this ironically. We can't really take this at face value. But it's really when we look at the second poem that we'll start to see how the value increases, and that the two poems together make a really good pair for lots of possible questions on this paper. So here's the second poem. It's much shorter, for instance, for a start, which is interesting in itself. Experience you expect would expand perspective. Here it seems to be shrinking it. But there's a tighter, more focused and more aware description of the situation here. We have a very similar start with that weeping, although only two cries rather than the three. But then another voice comes in, and the narrator seems to be a neutral sort of third-person narrator looking at this crying child and then asking, so perhaps it is the narrator, is it somebody else who asks, well, where's this child's parents? Now we get the answer. They were absent from the first poem. In this one, they've gone to the church to pray. And so straight away we get the idea of that hypocrisy of religion, that religious belief allows you to think that you're doing the right thing by just going to church, when in fact someone around you, somebody very close to you, is suffering badly and you're doing nothing about it. And for Blake, doing something about the suffering is what really Christianity should be all about. The narrator then becomes the child for the rest of the poem again. He takes over once more, and now he gives this specific realization that because he was happy, seems almost like a direct commentary on what was happening at the end of the first poem. Because he was happy, firstly, that his parents haven't noticed that there's a problem, but also it seems like it's almost like a punishment for his happiness, that there's a sort of in his own head, in his naivety, he thinks that anybody who is happy in this life is going to get punished, and that's what happens, and so now he's singing notes of woe. So there's a sort of ambiguity there, because he was crying in the first poem, but then seemed to turn that around at the end here, that those tears continue. But he does say, even in spite of those tears, he dances and sings in the final stanza. So it seems like he's talking about what happened in that first poem, where he finds some comfort, and they think they've done me no injury. So that's clear. But then the final two lines make it even more explicit who's to blame. It's God, his priest and king, who make up a heaven of our misery. So that there's this sense that their unhappiness is partly how Christian figures, both God and also his priests, and then the king, who's implicated in this because he's the head of the Church of England, they sort of thrive on this misery and somehow build their joy out of this misery. You can see that practically in terms of in the use of labour. The luxury and privilege of the wealthy is reliant upon the hard labour of the poor, and they make a joy out of the miserable lives of those who serve them. But God and the priest, obviously, it's less clear that they would benefit from the labour of the poor. And so there seems to be almost an idea there that Blake mistrusts God the Father, and this has been said from some of his other poems. He never states it directly in these poems, but he does in others, that Jesus is this kind of idol and hero, and the one that he thinks represents the true virtue and goodness of Christianity, and that God represents a sort of disapproving, authoritarian, and sometimes uncaring father figure. And so father and God and parents and God are mixed in here. So now this poem seems to read the other one for us and say, there was a problem there, didn't you notice it? And if we don't do something about that, then suffering is going to continue. Now, using the two poems together, you can really see that the lack of escape in the first poem is now highlighted here as being doubly impossible, because the parents are ignorant of the child's suffering, or and almost complacent, and possibly complicit in it, that they sort of almost benefit from it. Of course, they do financially. The child would bring some money into the family, and that's why he's been apprenticed to the chimney sweep in the first place. It takes a mouth away from the family to feed, but also possibly the money was given to the family at the point of apprenticeship, and any wages the child makes might go to the family. The parents are oppressive and controlling. Well, in a sinister and non-obvious way they are. Although they don't do anything horrendous in this either poem, they're not seen as shouting and beating and all the things that you might expect from an oppressive and controlling parent. But they are, by their actions, sending their child out to suffer terribly. And therefore you can certainly link it to words like oppression and control. Religion does come in more specifically here, and it does seem to be a thing of misery. And the word misery is used in this poem, and it's used in the question in 2019, so it'd be a good one to look at and say that really what happens is that the religious people seem to be complacent about the misery of others, when in fact that's what you think Christianity is all about, is trying to alleviate the misery of others. The human spirit has power to resist. There is some resistance here, but very minimal. There's kind of a sense of questioning and unhappiness about the situation, but there's no sense that the child has any power to change that situation. In fact, the opposite, that the situation is probably going to stay the same, because all the figures of authority, parents, but also both religious and governmental authorities, are at best just ignorant of the suffering, and at worst very happy for somebody to suffer in order for their aims and comforts to be assured. So there's no hope for the marginalised. We were asked in 2021, and clearly there is very little hope in this poem, or in the two together. Personal relationships are liberating and empowering, I think, would not be a good one for this poem. I don't think that you could have sort of argued that they're anything but if you want to look at father and mother here, but perhaps there are better ones for that question. The authority figures are unkind and show no compassion. Well, certainly that is very more explicit here than in the first one. So we have the authority figures mentioned, the parents, but then other figures of authority such as priest, king, and then of course God, and none of them seem to have any compassion for the suffering of these little children. And then in last year's question about innocence leading to joy and happiness, of course, is very much not the case here, although again there is moments of joy, there are moments of joy and happiness in the dancing and singing, and that has caused some of the problem actually, but it's more explicit here that is problematic. So chimney sweep, little boys were sent up chimneys to clean them in terribly dark, miserable conditions. If they complained and didn't want to climb up these chimneys to get the soot out, then sometimes the chimney sweeper himself would set a fire underneath to encourage the child to crawl up the chimney up to the top and climb out the top to get the fresh air and escape the heat. So they then would have a sack that they would collect the soot and other waste material in, and then often would take that sack home and sleep in it on the floor of the lodgings that the chimney sweeper had. So it was a dreadful, dreadful life, and of course, as you can imagine, crawling amongst black soot all day caused all sorts of diseases, minor respiratory diseases up to sort of major cancers. So it was a terrible, terrible thing to do to a child. And it just shows that perhaps that 18th century culture was very different from ours, and our compassion for children, publicly at least, is very important to us, whereas even on a very public and cultural scale, there seemed to be a quite calm acceptance of something that we now find appalling. So Blake is protesting in these two poems, and using two poems together, you can analyse both. I think you use the second poem to analyse the first. It's a nice way to do it. It gives a real sense of focus. If you had this with another pair of poems, such as the Holy Thursday poems in our last video, you would have a full essay there, 4 poems covered, using them together to comment on each other and to explore the theme, whichever it was that was noted in the question. These poems would be good for most questions.